Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today we're going to be analyzing a debate, a famous debate, obviously a debate that I have made reference to many times throughout the history of this channel, and that is the Greg Bahnsen, Gordon Stein debate. Now, there are a lot of resources out there about this debate. There have been commentary about this debate for a very long time. I mean, I'm not doing anything new. It's just something that I figured, let me kind of play the opening statements of each side and kind of offer my insights or, try to give a commentary as to what Dr. Bahnsen is trying to do in terms of laying out his case. And I want to make some application with what we hear in the debate and how we can use this kind of in a practical apologetics context. So I want to try my best to do that and hopefully clarify some things and make it useful and more accessible to the average listener who says, hey, I really want to be able to use this kind of apologetic. And so I'm going to try to do that. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm only dealing with Dr. Greg Bahnsen's opening statement. And then in another video, I will play Gordon Stein's opening statement, and we'll see how long it goes. If it's something that I like and I'm enjoying the process and, I'm trying to be creative here. And if it's something that you guys find useful, then maybe I'll try to unpack other parts of the debate as well. Maybe give some commentary on the cross-examination, things like that. But I want to bring to your attention a book that recently came out. I think it was by American Vision, but Joshua Pillows, a friend of mine who's been on the channel before, he edited and added commentary to the Greg Bahnsen debate in book form. So I think it's called The Great Debate. You can go over to AmericanVision.org and order that. I highly recommend. It is basically a running commentary on the debate. And so I'm intending to have my friend Joshua to come on the show and talk a little bit more about that debate. But here, I just want to talk about the debate itself. But there's resources out there. Highly recommend that you check that out. All right. Well, I don't want to take too much time because I'm going for a double header tonight. I am recording this, and then shortly after I'm recording this, I'm going to go live. So this is going to be pre-recorded. So if you're watching me now, obviously this came out. This would have come out by now, or it's coming out after my live stream. You get the point. Regardless, I want to jump right into this and kind of unpack Dr. Bahnsen's opening statement, and hopefully it will be useful for folks who are interested in presuppositional apologetics, the transcendental argument, so on and so forth. Just a couple of comments about the debate itself. I'm not going through Gordon Stein's opening statement, but in my opinion, I don't think that, and this is my opinion, I don't think that Gordon Stein was the best representative of atheism. Obviously, there are much more sophisticated atheistic philosophers and debaters out there. Just given his opening statement where he kind of critiques, and we'll get into this in another video, but when he begins to critique what we call the traditional proofs for God's existence, even at that level, I think he does not a really good job. But I think the beauty of this debate is not so much in the necessary strength or lack thereof of Dr. Bahnsen's opponents, but the strength of this debate is that we're able to see a presuppositional approach within a debate context and used very effectively to that end. And so I think it's a very good teaching tool. And of course, I mean, it's an epic debate. It's classic, right? So if you haven't listened to the debate, I highly recommend that you do. And then hopefully you can watch this and say, hey, this was really helpful. Maybe I didn't understand what Dr. Bahnsen was doing there, or why did he have his opener in the way that he did and not go in some other direction. So hopefully I can help you out in that regard. So let's jump right in here. I'm going to share the screen here. Obviously, the debate was not recorded via video. Okay, so there's only audio. This I don't know what channel this is. I guess we should give props to the channel. What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. I guess that's the name of the channel. I know nothing about this channel. I just looked for a remastered audio version of the debate because the original audio is pretty bad. But he's got like a little Bahnsen image here with his mouth moving. And then I would imagine that you have the same for Gordon Stein. So I thought that was kind of cool to share on the screen. So props for whoever put this video up. All right. So let's jump right in. I'm going to jump right into Dr. Bahnsen's opening statement, and then I'll kind of pause and talk and share my thoughts as we move along. All right. All right. So let's get started.
Thank you, David. I want to begin this evening with three opening and introductory remarks about the nature of the debate itself. First of all, it's necessary at the outset of our debate to define our terms. That's always the case. And in particular here, I should make it clear what I mean when I use the term God. I want to specify that I'm arguing particularly in favor of Christian theism and for it as a unit or system of thought and not for anything like theism in general.
All right, I want to stop right there. This is highly important, whether you're in a formal debate or you're in an interaction with an atheist or a skeptic or whoever. I think it's very important that Dr. Bahnsen starts with definitions. Regardless, if you're talking about the Christian worldview, what do you mean by the Christian worldview? What do you mean by theism? What do you mean by God? Dr. Bahnsen is laying out specifically that he is arguing for the Christian God. So this is very, very different than what you get in a lot of the classical apologetic opening statements, like someone like a William Lane Craig or someone along those lines, who try to demonstrate the existence of kind of like a generic deity. Okay, classical apologetics proceeds in two steps. The first step is to demonstrate the existence of a general deity. Okay, and they typically do this by utilizing the arguments that we call the theistic proofs, or they're the arguments that are typically associated with natural theology. And then from there, they will do the second step, which it will focus on the idea that it is the God of the Bible who has raised Jesus from the dead, and they kind of bring in the historical arguments and all that kind of stuff. Dr. Bahnsen here is doing something different, okay? He's defining his terms. He's saying, I am defending the Christian God. And notice what he says here, and maybe you can zoom in, or maybe I can make this larger here. Let me make this larger here so you can see. Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bahnsen U. Bahnsen U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bahnsen U Plus and Bahnsen U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. So it says here, he says, I want to specify that I'm arguing particularly in favor of Christian theism and for it as a unit or system of thought, and not for anything like theism in general. And there are reasons for that. And then he goes on to give his reasons. Now, I think this is very intentional. Obviously, Dr. Bahnsen is a student of Van Til. And if you look at how Van Til defined apologetics, I think this is very much in line with what he learned from Van Til. In Van Til's book, Christian Apologetics, on page 1, Dr. Van Til defines apologetics as the vindication of the Christian philosophy of life over against the non-Christian philosophy of life. And that language of the philosophy of life is intentional because Van Til is highlighting the fact that the nature of the apologetic dispute is one of worldview combat, hence the terminology philosophy of life. So look what Dr. Bahnsen says here. He says, I'm arguing particularly in favor of Christian theism and for it as a unit or system of thought. That's important because when you discuss a particular issue within the Christian faith or particular facts, Dr. Bahnsen is going to stress that those facts are only meaningful within the context of a broader system of facts and beliefs that one calls one's worldview. Okay, as Dr. Bahnsen has defined elsewhere, a worldview is a network of presuppositions not verified by empirical science and in terms of which all reality is interpreted. So Dr. Bahnsen is very intentional here, focusing on the fact that he is defending a system of thought, and he is not using what is typically used, what Dr. Van Til referred to as a blockhouse or piecemeal defense of the Christian faith. Okay, so I think that's significant there.
There are reasons for that. 3, the various conceptions of deity found in the world religions are, in most cases, logically incompatible, leaving no unambiguous sense to general theism, whatever that might be.
Now, he made mention, let me kind of go back there. Whoops, I went back too far there. Okay, so he says, let me go back. No, let's see. I'll let it play real quick. Hold up.
Thank you, David. I want to begin this evening with three opening and introductory remarks about the nature of the debate itself. First of all, it's necessary at the outset of our debate to define our terms. That's always the case. And in particular here, I should make it clear what I mean when I use the term God. I want to specify that I'm arguing particularly in favor of Christian theism and for it as a unit or system of thought, and not for anything like theism in general, and there are reasons for that. Three, the various conceptions of deity found in the world religions are, in most cases, logically incompatible, leaving no unambiguous sense to...
Right. Also, Dr. Bahnsen doesn't unpack this in the debate, but because real quick in the opening statement, he kind of hand waves other world religions. But in his preparation, he does have pre-planned responses to, well, what about this religion or what about that religion? I think it's very important that there's a difference between a formal debate in which you don't have time to get to everything and say kind of like a conversation over coffee where you might have time to go into more detail. So this is where you want to keep in mind that there is a distinction between formal debates and apologetics that you watch on YouTube and informal settings in apologetics where you're interacting with someone on the street, someone at your house, or someone at the coffee shop. So that's very, very important. So again, Dr. Bahnsen starts with defining his terms. He is defending specifically Christian theism, and he is defending Christian theism as a system of thought. So he is worldview conscious. Okay, I think that's very, very important. Let's let him continue.
General theism, whatever that might be. Secondly, I have not found the non-Christian religions to be philosophically defensible, each of them being internally incoherent or undermining human reason and experience.
Undermining human reason and experience. What he's alluding to there are worldviews that, when they undermine logic or reason or human experience, in some cases you might have worldviews who deny genuine distinctions. You have kind of these monistic worldviews that manifest in various religious perspectives, maybe something like a Hinduism that has kind of a pantheistic, monistic flavor to it. Such worldviews and such various manifestations of those worldviews might deny or reject genuine distinctions. So, for example, some Eastern pantheistic, monistic religions might say something along the lines that reality is an ultimate one. Now, if reality is an ultimate one, that runs roughshod into the problem of what happens when you have necessary distinctions, like making logical distinctions, okay? And so a lot of Eastern perspectives will reject kind of what they might call Western logic. And of course, Dr. Bahnsen kind of fleshes this out in various lectures when he's talking to the Hare Krishna who says reality is one and I reject Western logic. He turns around and says, well, so then you accept Western logic. No, I just told you I reject logic. No, so you don't reject logic. And of course, what he's doing there is trying to show that it is irrational to reject logic. So that's kind of what he's referring to. Like some of these religious systems, obviously there's more to flesh out there, but a lot of these religious systems, if you hypothetically grant what they're saying, they kind of undermine logical coherence and things like that. So that's kind of what he's getting at there.
And thirdly, since I am, by the grace of God, a Christian, I cannot from the heart adequately defend those religious faiths with which I disagree. My commitment is to the triune God and Christian worldview based on God's revelation in the Old and New Testaments. So first, then, I'm defending Christian theism. Secondly, I want to observe, and we should indicate just what it is and is not at issue in the debate on the basis of which we hope you'll consider the debate. It must be made clear that we are debating about philosophical systems, not the people who adhere to or profess them.
What did he say? We are debating philosophical systems. Let's get back there again.
Each of them being internally incoherent or undermining human reason and experience. And thirdly, since I am, by the grace of God, a Christian, I cannot from the heart adequately defend those religious faiths with which I disagree. My commitment is to the triune God and Christian worldview based on God's revelation in the Old and New Testaments. So first, then, I'm defending Christian theism. Secondly, I want to observe, and we should indicate just what it is and is not at issue in the debate on the basis of which we hope you'll consider the debate. It must be made clear that we are debating about philosophical systems, not the people who adhere to or profess them.
All right, that is important because Dr. Bahnsen is making a distinction between positions that people hold and the people themselves. Okay? Pardon. Very, very important. Okay? This happens a lot in informal settings. It can happen in debates as well. But in informal settings, we tend to get very emotional and then we begin to attack the person instead of what they're saying. And it could happen vice versa, right? A person's personality and the way they carry themselves is irrelevant as to whether their philosophy of life is correct, if they're, irrelevant as to the truth of their worldview. So you want to keep those things distinct. We're dealing with people's perspectives. We're tearing down arguments and every lofty thing that raises itself up against the knowledge of God. We're not talking about, this guy's really mean or this guy's, whatever. He's dealing with the rational, objective issue of whether the person's position is true, not whether, we think the person is smart or we think the person is nice or mean or whatever. That's key because sometimes we get caught up in the emotional aspect of the interaction. This happens in debates as well. It goes from analyzing arguments to then insulting people. And not only is that not Christian, that's not a Christian thing to do, although there is a place for kind of bringing up someone's character, obviously. But within the context of a rational discourse, we want to focus on the arguments, not so much on the person itself, person himself, when we're analyzing what they're saying. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Our concern is with the objective merits of the case which can be made for atheism or Christian theism, not related subjective or personal matters. And again, I have 3 reasons for illustrations of this. The personalities of those individuals who adhere to different systems of thought are not really relevant to the truth or falsity of the claims made by those systems.
That's right. Okay. And this happens too, like, for example, if I were to say extreme Muslims fly planes into buildings, that's why I don't believe in Islam. Well, even if it's true that an extremist Muslim flies a plane into a building, that's irrelevant as to whether Islam is true. Okay. Now, it might be relevant to show kind of behavior that's associated with a particular understanding of a religious perspective or what have you. And I'm not trying to lump all Muslims in that particular category. I mean, there are people who know far more about Islam than I do, and I don't necessarily equate that kind of extreme position with every single Muslim. I'm just using this as an example. If that's the basis upon which someone rejects Islam, okay, that's an irrational basis because it is irrelevant as to whether Islam is actually true. Okay, so he says we're not dealing with the personalities of those individuals who adhere to different systems of thought. He says they're not really relevant to the truth or falsity of the claims made by those systems. Again, the hypocrisy of certain Christians is irrelevant as to whether Jesus rose from the dead or the Christian worldview is true. Because Dr. Bahnsen is going to point out that both atheists and Christians can be guilty of all sorts of things. That doesn't mean that their positions their respective positions are necessarily false or true.
Atheists and Christians can equally be found emotional, unlearned, intolerant, or rude in their approaches. Secondly, subjective claims made about the experience of inner satisfaction or peace, claims that are made, interestingly, by both Christians and atheists in their literature. And promotional claims made about the superiority of Christianity or...
Right, so Christianity makes me feel good. Christianity makes me feel fulfilled in life. That's great. That might be true, but again, completely irrelevant as to whether Christianity is true. Or Mormonism changed my life. That might be true, right? You might be on a human level highly moral because you're a Mormon, but that doesn't mean Mormonism's true, right? So again, you want to make those proper distinctions.
Atheism, for instance, some atheist literature suggests that greater mental health comes through the independence of the atheist outlook. These sorts of things are always subject to conflicting interpretations and explanations, being, I think, more autobiographical rather than telling us anything for sure about the truth of the system under consideration. Thirdly, the issue is not whether atheists or professing Christians have ever done anything undesirable or morally unacceptable. One need only think respectively of the atheist involvement in the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution and the professing Christian involvement in the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the question is not whether adherents of these systems have lived spotless lives, but whether atheism or Christian theism as philosophical systems are objectively true. And so I'll be defending Christian theism, and I'll be defending it as a philosophical system. And my last introductory remark is simply to the effect that I want to concede to my opponent all issues pertaining to the control of ovarian maturation in Japanese quail. Okay.
All right, so there's a little giggle at this. He says, my last introductory remark is simply to the effect that I want to concede to my opponent all issues pertaining to the control of ovarian maturation in Japanese quail, which was the subject of Dr. Stein's doctoral dissertation over there at Ohio State. Now, some people think that was kind of a jab that Dr. Bahnsen was giving to Gordon Stein. I don't think that. Maybe it was. But I think it's important to admit when an area is not your expertise. So, for example, I'm not a scientist. So if I were debating a scientist or I was having an apologetic encounter with a scientist, whether a professor or whatever, I think it's important to admit areas where, hey, I'm not an expert in that area, so that's not the level of which I'm addressing you. But the nature of our discussion is actually very different. This is very important because a lot of people who have PhDs in, say, science are often taken to be experts in areas that they actually aren't experts in. So to have a PhD in science does not make you an expert in philosophy. Now, that being said, just because you're not an expert in something doesn't mean you have nothing meaningful to say about those things, okay? I also disagree with people say, well, you're not a scientist, so you can't possibly say anything right if it has to do with science. That doesn't follow at all. Even an uneducated but somewhat, intelligent individual can point out logical fallacies in the reasoning of a logician who has a PhD in logic or is a professional philosopher. But be that as it may, I think when you're interacting with someone, there's nothing wrong with admitting, hey, that's your area of expertise. I respect that. But really, the nature of our discussion is very different. And so I think rhetorically, this is a very useful move for Dr. Bahnsen in this particular context, because while Gordon Stein has detailed knowledge in the area of science, it is Dr. Bahnsen here that is the expert in philosophy. Okay, he had a PhD as an analytic philosopher. Whether you like him or not or agree, he knows the field of philosophy. And so this is really good rhetorically because that's really the nature of this specific debate. And so that's what he uses this, I think, in a rhetorically persuasive way. As he'll point out here, this is an area that he is, able to speak to with some proficiency.
Did his doctoral dissertation in 1974 at Ohio State. Dr. Stein is a man of intelligence, and that's not in question in this debate. I would not pretend to hold my own in a discussion with him of the empirical details of his narrow domain of specialized natural science. However, our subject tonight is really much different, calling for intelligent reflection upon issues which are philosophical or theological in character. For some reason, Dr. Stein has, over the last decade, left his field of expertise and given his life to a campaign for atheism. Whatever his perception of the reason for that, I do not believe that it is because of any genuinely cogent philosophical case which might be made for atheism as a worldview. And it's to this subject which I now turn for tonight's debate.
Now, some atheists might take issue with Dr. Bahnsen's utilization of the language of the atheistic worldview. And so people say, atheism is not a worldview. My non-belief in God or my lack of belief in God or however you want to define it has no bearing on any other perspective in life. Actually, it does, and that's not the topic of this debate, but you could qualify it any manifestation of atheism, okay? Anyone who's an atheist, he would say that there is no rational grounds given any form of atheism. Now, again, that's the point that's being debated, right? That's why we go back and forth. But you might get kind of pushback there. Some atheists don't like when we call atheism a worldview. But you should know, okay, let them say that, but you should know that when you reject God, that has worldview implications, whether you recognize it or not. So I have no problem calling atheism a worldview, although, yeah, sure, there might be different flavors of atheistic thinking and so on and so forth. But Dr. Bahnsen would argue that none of the forms, whether you break them up into different categories, none of them are able to provide, as he'll lay out the transcendental argument and so forth, that none of them have the capacity to provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience, so on and so forth.
My opening case for the existence of God will cover three areas of thought.
Okay, this is going to be key here. So in terms of using the transcendental argument, for the existence of God. I love how he breaks down the way in which he kind of unpacks his presentation here. This is useful in public debate, but it is also useful in common conversation, okay? So I'm going to read this here real quick, and then I'll let Dr. Bahnsen finish his statement there. He says, my opening case for the existence of God will cover 3 areas of thought. And you might want to write this down, okay? Because they're relevant to the discussion. Number 1, Dr. Bahnsen says the nature of evidence, the presuppositional conflict of worldviews, and finally, the transcendental argument for God's existence. Now, the way he broke that down there is, and the way he's going to break it down is very, very intentional. The nature of evidence, okay? I think it's essential to talk about the nature of evidence before you just jump into a discussion of the evidence. Because if you're a Christian and you have an atheist friend and you had conversations and discussions with them, what's the main point you're disagreeing over? Right? It's the evidence. Oh, that's not really evidence for God. That's really, but then they give the counter evidence and you have one guy giving evidence, the other guy giving evidence, and you begin kind of talking past each other. Okay. Dr. Van Til often referred to this as the philosophy of facts. Van Til said, I have no problem giving facts to the unbeliever, but I will not go on and on about the facts without also addressing the philosophy of fact. What is it about the unbeliever's worldview that impacts how they understand what makes something a fact or what makes something count as evidence? Right? So it's important to kind of get that nailed down, right? That's why we typically ask, well, what kind of evidence would convince you, right? That question is often brought up in apologetic interactions. And that's a strategic question. It's not a trick question, but it's a fair question, because when we put forth evidence for the existence of God or the truth of the Bible, when the unbeliever says that doesn't count as evidence, we wonder, well, why doesn't it count as evidence? We might be operating under different understandings of what counts as evidence. As you guys know, our good friend and faithful listener, an atheist, I think he's an atheist. He sounds like an atheist in his comments. Nick Jones, right? You guys know Nick Jones. Everyone knows Nick Jones on this channel. He says, give me one scrap of credible evidence. Okay. Again, Dr. Bahnsen would point out, well, let's talk about the nature of evidence. You talk about credible evidence. That's a very ambiguous concept because credibility varies from person to person, okay? What one person considers credible is not going to be the same thing someone else considers credible. And so instead of just succumbing to giving the quote-unquote evidence when they ask for it, which you can, but you always want to keep in the back of your mind the importance of the fact that you and the unbeliever disagree over the nature of evidence itself. That is going to be an important piece of information that you're going to want to hold on to when you have discussions with people. Where's the evidence for your God? Well, what do you mean by evidence? That's a key question. And so I think that's why Dr. Bahnsen talks about the nature of evidence, and he's going to talk about how the unbeliever and the believer have opposing worldviews that impact how we interpret the evidence. And he talks about that there's this conflict, right? This presuppositional conflict of worldviews. And then once he lays that out, he kind of sets up the situation where the Christian has the worldview over here, the unbeliever has his worldview over there. So what do? Are we stuck in our worldviews, or is there a way to vindicate one person's philosophy of life over against the other person's philosophy of life? And that's where he kind of lays out the transcendental argument, okay? For us common folk who are not in formal debates, you could pretty much say it along the lines of, well, what do you mean by evidence, Mr. Skeptic? Okay. Well, I think you define evidence that way because you have certain assumptions that I don't share. And that's why I say evidence is this thing over here. And you say evidence is that. This counts as evidence. The reason why we disagree is because we actually disagree over the nature of what evidence is because of our assumptions, right? I have a worldview. You have a worldview. And so the skeptic might say, okay, well, if I have a worldview and I'm going to filter what you say through my worldview, and you have a worldview and you're going to filter everything you say through your worldview, I guess we can't talk to each other. And of course, the Christian's going to respond, well, no, we can talk to each other. There is a way to communicate, and that's where Dr. Bahnsen is suggesting that we lay out the transcendental argument. Philosophically, you're not going to use this language, but philosophically, the transcendental argument, if it is successful, right, will break the worldview tie, so to speak. I have my worldview, my presuppositions. You have your worldview, your presuppositions. How do we move from there? Transcendental proof. That's what Dr. Bahnsen's laying out here. All right, let's let him continue.
They are the nature of evidence, the presuppositional conflict of worldviews, and finally the transcendental argument for God's existence. First of all, the nature of evidence. How should the difference of opinion between the theist and the atheist be rationally resolved? What Dr. Stein has written indicates that he, like many atheists, has not reflected adequately on this question. He writes, and I quote, "The question of the existence of God
This is key, so pay attention here.
is a factual question and should be answered in the same way as any other factual question." End of quote. The assumption that all existence claims are questions about matters of fact, the assumption that these are all answered in the very same way, is not merely oversimplified and misleading. It is simply mistaken.
Isn't that true? So Dr. Bahnsen says the assumption that all existence claims about what exists are questions about matter of fact. The assumptions that these are all answered in the very same way is not merely oversimplified, it's misleading, and it is simply mistaken, or you can just flat out wrong. Yeah, this is important because Dr. Bahnsen is going to unpack something very, very significant here, is that not all things are proven in the exact same way. Okay? A thing is proven in a particular way depending upon the nature of the thing under discussion. And so Dr. Bahnsen is going to use the example of the crackers in the pantry, right? How do I prove to you the existence of crackers in my pantry? Well, the nature of crackers is such that I can take you by the hand, bring you to my pantry, and show you the crackers. However, if I were to show you that the air pressure in this room was a particular, percentage or whatever, I might have to use a different tool. I can't just take you into the room and say, "You feel that? There you go. This is the pressure." No, I have to actually use. Is it a barometer? I think it's a barometer. Is that what you use to measure air pressure? Maybe someone can let me know in the comments. But you get the point. Depending on the nature of the thing under discussion, that's going to impact the manner in which we proceed to demonstrate it. And so not all things are demonstrated in the same way. And a lot of skeptics often assume that, as Dr. Stein does. And some people, if they're kind of like empiricists, they'll say, well, all things are proven in the same way by observation and experience or something along those lines. Okay, you have different people who have different perspectives on that. But what Dr. Bahnsen is pointing out is the nature of how things are proven. They're not proven in the exact same way. And this touches on the issue of the skeptic's epistemology, his theory of knowledge, right? Don't let the unbeliever simply take their epistemology for granted. And unbelievers who are aware of the importance of these worldview issues will not let the believer take his epistemology for granted. And that's why, and this is something that we don't want to do. We're not simply taking the Christian worldview for granted without desiring to show why the Christian worldview can answer these questions and can provide a basis for all the things that we typically talk about. And that's just the issue of worldview. Like, I have a worldview. You're welcome to internally critique my worldview, but let's not pretend that the skeptic doesn't have a worldview, right? Sometimes the skeptic is so steeped in his worldview that they just look at their view as kind of a default position, right? I don't have to defend this because this is easy, right? We demonstrate all things by, and then, you lay out, the person lays out their philosophy. So again, very, very important. He says the assumption that all existence claims are questions about matters of fact, the assumption that these are all answered in the very same way is not merely oversimplified and misleading, it is simply mistaken. Let's continue.
The existence, factuality, or reality of different kinds of things is not established or disconfirmed in the same way in every case. We might ask, is there a box of crackers in the pantry? And we know how we would go about answering that question. But that is a far, far cry from the way we go about answering a question and determining the reality of, say, barometric pressure, quasars, gravitational attraction, elasticity, radioactivity, natural laws, names, grammar, numbers, the university itself that you're now at, past events, categories, future contingencies, laws of thought, political obligations.
See, now look at the list that he gives, demonstrating that not all of these things are proven in the exact same way. These things are proven, if they are proven at all, in ways that cater to the nature of the thing themselves, okay? I love how he kind of just lists these out to kind of belabor the point, because Dr. Stein's assumption that things are determined in the exact same way is just false. And these are good evidence to the contrary with respect to that position.
Individual identity over time, causation, memories, dreams, or even love or beauty. In such cases, one does not do anything like walking to the pantry and looking inside for the crackers. There are thousands of existence or factual questions, and they are not at all answered in the same way in each case. Just think of the differences in argumentation and types of evidence used by biologists, grammarians, physicists, mathematicians, lawyers, logicians, mechanics, merchants, and artists. It should be obvious that the type of evidence which one looks for in existence or factual claims will be determined by the field of discussion, and especially by the metaphysical nature of the
Now, this is important. So he says it should be obvious that the types of evidence which one looks for in existence of factual claims will be determined by the field of discussion, and especially by the metaphysical nature of the entity mentioned in the claim under question. Now, the problem that is raised here is that there is a disagreement often as to the metaphysical nature of the entity mentioned in the claim under discussion. And that's why it's important that we lay out our what? Our worldview. When I speak of logic, right, when we talk about logic from a Christian worldview, I understand that I have a particular understanding metaphysically of what logic is. When I say logic exists, I have a particular ontology that I'm assuming. I have a particular metaphysical perspective I'm assuming. I understand that the unbeliever has a different understanding of that as well. Okay? I believe that logic reflects the mind of God, and I think that's a meaningful statement within a Christian worldview. And the unbeliever doesn't hold to that. They have a different understanding of logic. Maybe someone has, maybe they're a nominalist. They think that logic is not something that's like in a universal category, or maybe the person says that logic is a language we developed to describe the consistency of reality, or whatever view that they hold, okay? There is a worldview disagreement over the metaphysical nature of the things that we tend to debate over. And so I think it's important to point that out. Now, Dr. Bahnsen here, is highlighting the fact that not all things are demonstrated in the exact same way. In the case of this particular debate, the nature of the proof and demonstration is going to depend upon the metaphysical nature of the thing in question. And so with respect to the existence of God, who is by nature immaterial, God is not extended in space in any way, shape, or form, okay? Because of the nature of God, the nature of the demonstration for God is not going to be the same kind of demonstration that is utilized when you open up the pantry to show the person who's doubting the crackers that the crackers are there. You're not going to use that same method. And that's really the point of what Dr. Bahnsen is getting at here.
Entity mentioned in the claim under question. Dr. Stein's remark that the existence of God is answered, the question of the existence of God is answered in the same way as any other factual question, mistakenly reduces the theistic question to the same level as a box of crackers in the pantry, which we will hereafter call the crackers in the pantry fallacy. Secondly, then, I'd like to talk about the presuppositional conflict of worldviews. Dr. Stein has written about the nature of evidence in the theistic debate, and what he has said points to a second philosophical error of significant proportions. In passing, we would note how unclear he is, by the way, in speaking of the evidence which must be used, describing it variously as logic, facts, or reason. Each of these terms is susceptible to a whole host of differing senses, not only in philosophy.
That's important too. So when people use logic, facts, and reason, you always want to ask the question, well, what do you mean by that? Because typically people will use that as though there's just this common understanding. You know, I believe in reason. Well, what kind of reason? Are you using reason in a Cartesian sense, in a Kantian sense, in an Aristotelian sense? Like, we want to ask questions so as to not let people simply take for granted their particular understanding, because words have baggage, right? Words come with baggage. And for the Christian, when we use words, there's baggage implied in there as well. So that's why we have to define what we mean. We don't always do it, all the time in the right way. But from going forward, you want to be mindful of making sure you define your terms, because the skeptic is going to be like, well, if that's what you're saying, I disagree. And so that's a helpful thing to point out, right? Because if the goal is clarity and truth, I want the skeptic to say, well, wait a minute, if you define terms that way, I disagree. And so, okay, well, let's have that conversation. And I think hopefully it goes vice versa as well. When the Christian says, well, if that's what you mean by evidence, I don't agree with that definition of evidence. If evidence is by definition something that can be observed, right? I don't agree with that. I don't think that evidence is only empirical. And then you might have to have that dispute, that discussion over the nature of evidence, so on and so forth.
But especially in ordinary usage, depending on who's using the terms. I take it he wishes to judge hypotheses in the common sense by test of logical coherence and empirical observation. The problem arises when Dr. Stein elsewhere insists that every claim which someone makes must be treated as a hypothesis which must be tested by such evidence before accepting it. There is to be nothing, he says, which smacks of begging the question or circular reasoning.
Right. So this is important. So he says here, the problem arises when Dr. Stein elsewhere insists that every claim that someone makes must be treated as a hypothesis, which must be tested by such evidence before accepting it. There is to be, Dr. Stein says, there is to be nothing, he says, which smacks of begging the question or circular reasoning. This, I think, is oversimplified thinking and, again, misleading, Dr. Bahnsen says, what we might call the pretended neutrality fallacy. Again, I've mentioned a lot on this channel. That is really the heart of the unbelieving position, especially the skeptic, right? Is this assumption of neutrality, right? And this idea that, all forms of circularity, you can't be circular in any way, shape, or form. But what Dr. Bahnsen points out beautifully in just a moment is that while Dr. Stein claims to be neutral, he obviously is not, for reasons that Dr. Bahnsen will lay out in just a moment. Let's let him lay that out.
This, I think, is oversimplified thinking and, again, misleading, what we might call the pretended neutrality fallacy. One can see this by considering the following quotation from Dr. Stein, and I quote, "The use of logic or reason is the only valid way to examine the truth or falsity of a statement which claims to be factual." That's the end of the quote. One must eventually ask Dr. Stein, then, how he proves this statement itself. That is, how does he prove that logic or reason is the only way to prove factual statements?
This is key, so you need to make sure you're zeroing in on this. Ready, go.
He's now on the horns of a real epistemological dilemma. If he says that the statement is proven by logic or reason, then he's engaging in circular reasoning and he's begging the question, which he staunchly forbids. If he says that the statement is proven in some other fashion, then he refutes the statement itself, that logic or reason is the only way to prove things. Now, my point is not to fault Dr. Stein's commitment to logic or reason, but to observe that it actually has the nature of a pre-commitment or a presupposition. It is not something he has proven by empirical experience or logic, but it is rather that by which he proceeds to prove everything else. He is not presuppositionally neutral in his approach to factual questions.
Right. And so Dr. Bahnsen is not simply, again, he's not faulting, this is what he says, and my point is not to fault Dr. Stein's commitment to logic or reason. Dr. Bahnsen is committed to logic and reason as well. The point is to show that Dr. Stein and no one else is neutral, even though that seems like that's the standard that they're calling for, right? I need an objective, independent proof, as though we can talk about facts and evidence in a neutral fashion, right? Even the attempted neutral approach is itself not neutral, as we've explained and explored throughout this the history of this channel.
And disputes. He does not avoid begging crucial questions rather than proving them in what we might call the garden variety, ordinary way. Now, this tendency to beg crucial questions is openly exposed by Dr. Stein when the issue becomes the existence of God, because he demands that the theists present him with evidence for the existence of God. Now, theists like myself would gladly and readily do so. There is the evidence of the created order itself, testifying to the wisdom, power, plan, and glory of God. One should not miss the testimony of the solar system, the persuasion of the sea, the amazing intricacies of the human body. There's the evidence of history, God's deliverance of his people, the miracles at Passover night in the Red Sea, the visions of Isaiah, the Shekinah glory in the temple, the virgin birth of Jesus, his mighty miracles, his resurrection from the dead. There's the evidence of special revelation, the wonder of the Bible as God's word, unsurpassed in its coherence over time, and its historical accuracy, and its life-renewing power. In short, there is no shortage of empirical indicators or evidences of God's existence, from the 1,000 stars of the heavens to the 500 witnesses.
So the 500 witnesses of the resurrection. Now, what's the problem? These are evidences, but is the unbeliever going to accept any of that as being evidence? Well, of course not. And the reason is why? Hopefully you can tell by now, right? The reason is presuppositions. The unbeliever is operating under different presuppositions than the Christian. It's not that the Christian faith has no evidence. It's that the evidence that we give is going to be interpreted in light of one's worldview. And so the question then becomes, well, who is operating under the correct worldview, under the correct interpretive lens? And so, again, Dr. Bahnsen, I think, masterfully exposes the non-neutral nature of Dr. Bahnsen's position, and by extension, the non-neutral position of anybody, right? Again, to say that you're neutral is already to be non-neutral against the position that says neutrality is impossible, right? There is no neutrality. It is a myth.
Of Christ's resurrection. But Dr. Stein precludes the very possibility of any of this empirical evidence counting as proof of God's existence. He writes, and now I quote, "Supernatural explanations are not allowed in science. The theist is hard put to document his claims to the existence of the supernatural if he is, in effect, forbidden from invoking the supernatural as a part of his explanation. Of course, this is entirely fair, as it would be begging the question to use what has to be proved as a part of the explanation." End of quote. In advance, you see, Dr. Stein is committed to disallowing any theistic interpretation of nature, history, or experience.
Again, because he sees his position as the default, but it's not. Right? It is in conflict a priori. It's in conflict beforehand without demonstrating its legitimacy. It's in conflict against the position that says every fact only has its meaning as it is interpreted in light of God and his revelation, right? So in advance, you see, Dr. Stein is committed to disallowing any theistic interpretation of nature, history, or experience. But then again, this is Dr. Bahnsen will point out of begging the question on the part of Dr. Stein.
What he seems to overlook is that this is just as much begging the question on his own part as it is on the part of the theists who appeal to such evidence. He has not at all proven by empirical observation and logic his pre-commitment to naturalism. He has assumed it in advance, accepting and rejecting all further factual claims in terms of that controlling and unproven assumption. Now, the theist does the very same thing, don't get me wrong. When certain empirical evidences are put forth as allegedly disproving the existence of God, the theist regiments his commitments in terms of his presuppositions as well. See, just as the naturalist would insist that Christ could not have risen from the dead, or that there is a natural explanation yet to be found of how he did rise from the dead.
Right, this is what Jason Lisle has described in his book, The Ultimate Proof for Creation, when he talks about evidences and presuppositions. This is what we call rescuing devices, right? Because we have certain commitments that we're not going to give up, right? We have ways to rescue. When counter evidence to our position comes in, we don't just give up our presuppositions. We have rescuing devices. There are explanations and qualifications and all these sorts of things. Everybody does that for the precise reason that we do have pre-commitments, presuppositions that we're not willing to easily give up. All right, that's kind of the point of what he's getting at.
So the supernaturalist insists that the alleged discrepancies in the Bible have an explanation, some yet to be found perhaps, and that the evil of this world has a sufficient reason behind it, known at least to God. They both have their governing presuppositions by which the facts of experience are interpreted, even as all philosophical systems, all worldviews do. At the most fundamental level of everyone's thinking and beliefs, there are primary convictions about reality, man, the world, knowledge, truth, behavior, and such things. Convictions about which all other experience is organized, interpreted, and applied. Dr. Stein has such presuppositions, and so do I, and so do all of you. And it is these presuppositions which determine what we accept by ordinary reasoning and evidence, for they are assumed in all of our reasoning, even about reasoning itself. And so I come thirdly then to the transcendental proof of God's existence.
So notice the order of what Dr. Bahnsen has done. He's given definitions. He's discussed the nature of worldview conflict. Okay. He gave definitions, gave an explanation of the nature of evidence itself. Explained for us the issue that the dispute between the believer and the unbeliever is a worldview issue. And he demonstrated this by the fact that at a fundamental level, we all kind of assume our position at the get-go, highlighting the fact that none of us are neutral. And then when that groundwork is laid out, then he offers the transcendental argument. So there's a very intentional move from his primary definitions at the beginning to what he unpacks towards the end. Now, some people might like how he did this. One of the things that I wish Dr. Bahnsen did, although, I mean, I like his opening statement. I think he masterfully laid out his case. I just wish that he left more time to unpack the transcendental argument. But that's hard to do, to fit all those things in. If Dr. Bahnsen started with the transcendental argument without laying the groundwork, then I don't think his presentation would have landed with audiences. So I think it was necessary for him to kind of give all of that preamble information. But again, you could wish, I wish that he went into a little bit more detail on fleshing out the transcendental argument. But again, I think he did a masterful job here.
How then should the difference of opinion between the theist and the atheist be rationally resolved? That was my opening question. We've seen two of Dr. Stein's errors regarding it: the crackers in the pantry fallacy and the pretended neutrality fallacy. In the process of discussing them, we have observed that belief in the existence of God is not tested in any ordinary way like other factual claims. And the reason for that is metaphysically because of the non-natural character of God, and epistemologically because of the presuppositional character of commitment for or against his existence. Arguments over conflicting presuppositions between worldviews, therefore, must be resolved somewhat differently, and yet still rationally, than conflicts over factual existence claims within a worldview.
Again, so when we're dealing with demonstrating our ultimate foundations, demonstrating the truth of our ultimate foundations is going to be very different than demonstrating generic, non-paradigmatic factual claims of, say, the price of eggs at the supermarket or some localized domain of human experience. When we're dealing with a worldview, a paradigm perspective, that's going to be very different. And so Dr. Bahnsen is highlighting the fact that the way we prove those ultimate foundations, okay, is not appealing to kind of these isolated facts within the worldview, but appealing to the transcendental necessity of the particular paradigm in question. And of course, obviously, he's making that case for that being the Christian worldview.
Or system of thoughts. When we go to look at the different worldviews that atheists and theists have, I suggest that we can prove the existence of God from the impossibility of the contrary. The transcendental proof for God's existence is that without Him, it is impossible to prove anything. The atheist worldview is irrational and cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality. The atheist worldview cannot allow for laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, the ability for the mind to understand the world, and moral absolutes. And in that sense, the atheist worldview cannot account for the debate
tonight. So look what he says here. So this is kind of the broad strokes of the transcendental argument. Obviously, this would have to be fleshed out, which I think, at least with respect to logic, is fleshed out pretty good in this debate. I think he effectively, when Dr. Stein kind of figured out, okay, I think I know what Dr. Bahnsen's getting at, he doesn't do very well in terms of actually providing a rational justification for the laws of logic within his own worldview. Again, I don't think all of these necessary preconditions, if you will, are fleshed out in the debate. But again, in broad brushstrokes, Dr. Bahnsen says that the transcendental proof for God's existence is that without Him, it is impossible to prove anything. Now, you have to be careful. A lot of presuppositionalists who latch onto that will use that phrase as though the phrase itself is an offering of the actual argument. Remember, in logic, when you make an argument, when you lay out your argument, that doesn't mean you've proven your argument. You have to unpack that. Okay, so Dr. Bahnsen says here, the atheist worldview is irrational and cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality. And I think Dr. Bahnsen was able to get into some of those things, I think, very effectively. But again, more would have to be unpacked. The atheist worldview cannot allow for the laws of logic. I think Dr. Bahnsen does well in this debate, showing why that's the case. The uniformity of nature, the ability of the mind to understand the world and moral absolutes. And in that sense, kind of a rhetorical move here. In that sense, the atheist worldview cannot account for our debate tonight. And then Dr. Bahnsen makes a mention that Gordon Stein lost the debate by showing up, namely because the nature of Dr. Stein's worldview is in conflict with the very tools that one needs to even engage in rational debate and discourse. So I thought, from a rhetorical perspective, that was a good move by Dr. Bahnsen.
Our debate tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Bahnsen.
All right, so that concludes the opening statement of Dr. Bahnsen. Okay, so yeah, and the next video, I want to kind of jump right in. I won't have any, introductions or anything like that. I'll kind of just jump in and be like, hey, welcome back. We're going to jump into Gordon Stein's opening statement. So, hey, I might like to do a lot more of these sorts of things, kind of play opening statements and share my thoughts, some presuppositional nuggets here and there. If you like that approach, let me know in the comments or email me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com. As I've said before, I want to make content that you're going to find useful. So if this kind of format is useful to you, let me know. I'd be happy to do more of it. Well, until next time, guys, I will see you later for part 2 as we walk through the opening statement of Dr. Gordon Stein in the epic and legendary debate, Greg Bahnsen versus Gordon Stein, Does God Exist? Until next time, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.